The winter of 1916 carved deep scars into the earth between the German and British lines near the Somme Valley, where endless rain transformed no man's land into a grey wasteland of mud and wire and death. The trenches stretched for miles in zigzagging patterns, designed to contain blast waves and prevent enfilade fire. But after months of bombardment, they had become waterlogged graves, where men stood knee-deep in freezing sludge and watched rats feast on the remains of their comrades. Private Thomas Hartley of the Yorkshire Regiment pressed his back against the crumbling sandbags and tried to remember what warmth felt like, while across the scarred wasteland, barely 200 yards away, Corporal Friedrich Weber of the Bavarian Reserve Infantry did the same. Both men were 23 years old, and both had been farmers before the war called them away from fields that grew wheat and barley instead of corpses. The mechanical brutality of modern warfare had stripped away any romantic notions they once held about glory or honor, leaving only the primal instinct to survive another day in conditions that reduced human beings to shivering animals focused solely on staying alive. When the artillery fell silent for brief moments, the absence of sound felt more terrifying than the explosions, because in that silence men could hear their own thoughts and remember that they were supposed to be human. The British trenches near Beaumont Hamel had seen 3 major offensives in as many months, and each attack resulted in thousands of casualties with negligible gains measured in yards rather than miles. The officers in their dugouts studied maps and planned strategies, while the men in the forward positions counted their remaining cigarettes and wrote letters home that would never mention the true horror of their circumstances. Lieutenant James Morrison had arrived from Oxford with a classics degree and a head full of Homeric ideals about warfare, but 3 weeks in the trenches taught him that modern combat bore no resemblance to ancient heroism. He watched his men deteriorate, not just from enemy fire but from trench foot and dysentery, and the soul-crushing monotony of waiting for death in a ditch. The rats grew fat and bold, feeding on rations and fallen soldiers alike, while lice infested every uniform and drove men to madness with constant itching. Morrison had stopped trying to keep his section of trench clean after realizing the futility of imposing order on chaos. Across no man's land, the German positions suffered identical miseries, despite propaganda that claimed their engineering and discipline made their trenches superior. Friedrich Weber had learned to sleep standing up with his rifle propped against his shoulder, because lying down meant sinking into the mud and possibly drowning if exhaustion overcame vigilance. His company had lost 30% of its strength to illness and enemy fire since October, and replacements arrived as frightened boys who died before learning how to survive. The older soldiers, like Weber, taught the newcomers which sounds meant danger and which could be ignored. But some lessons could only be learned through experience, and many did not live long enough to gain that wisdom. Weber carried a small photograph of his wife Anna and their daughter Greta, who was 3 years old, and who he had not seen in 14 months. At night, when the guns quieted, he would take out the photograph and try to remember Anna's voice, but the memory grew fainter with each passing week. The High Command on both sides viewed the Western Front as a mathematical problem, requiring sufficient application of men and shells to break through enemy lines and restore mobile warfare. Generals studied casualty ratios and ammunition expenditures, while making plans that treated soldiers as interchangeable units rather than individual human beings with families and dreams. The soldiers in the trenches understood that their lives meant nothing to the officers in comfortable headquarters, miles behind the front, where hot meals and clean beds insulated them from the reality of combat. This disconnect between command and execution created a bitter cynicism among frontline troops who followed orders because military law demanded obedience, not because they believed in the strategic vision of their superiors. Both British and German soldiers had more in common with each other than with their own officers, and on quiet nights they could hear enemy voices singing songs that spoke of home and loved ones and the universal desire for the war to end. The arrival of winter brought new suffering, as temperatures dropped below freezing and turned standing water into ice that made movement treacherous and frostbite, as dangerous as enemy bullets. Supply lines struggled to deliver adequate food and fuel to forward positions, leaving men to burn whatever they could find for brief moments of warmth. The dead remained unburied in no man's land, because any attempt at recovery drew immediate fire from enemy snipers who waited patiently for targets. Thomas Hartley wondered how much longer he could endure this existence that resembled hell more than anything described in Scripture, and whether he would ever return to Yorkshire and his family's farm. Across the wasteland, Friedrich Weber wondered the same about Bavaria, and whether Greta would recognize him if he survived long enough to go home. Neither man knew that within days, a small terrier would burst into their collapsing world, carrying something in its teeth that would unite them in ways no diplomatic effort ever could. The British had brought dogs to the front for various purposes, including ratting and companionship, and carrying messages through terrain too dangerous for human runners. These animals adapted to trench life with remarkable resilience and provided psychological comfort to men starved for affection in a world devoted to killing. Among the dogs in the Yorkshire Regiment's sector was a small wire-haired terrier named Scraps, who belonged to no one soldier in particular, but had adopted the entire company as his pack. He scavenged food from rations and slept wherever he found warm bodies willing to share space, and his presence reminded the men of normal life when dogs were pets rather than tools of war. Scraps possessed an uncanny ability to sense incoming artillery seconds before the shells arrived, and his sudden dash toward dugouts saved lives by warning men to take cover. The soldiers fed him whatever scraps they could spare, despite their own hunger, because the dog represented innocence and loyalty, in a place where both had become rare commodities. Private Hartley had grown particularly fond of Scraps after the terrier spent 3 consecutive nights sleeping against his legs and sharing body heat during a cold snap that killed 2 men from exposure. Hartley rationed part of his breakfast biscuit each morning to feed the dog, and in return Scraps would perform tricks learned from previous owners or perhaps invented through observation of human behavior. The other men in Hartley's section appreciated the dog's presence because it gave them something to care for beyond mere survival, and discussions about Scraps provided conversation topics that did not involve death or home. Lieutenant Morrison initially disapproved of keeping animals in the trenches, citing regulations about hygiene and discipline, but eventually conceded that morale benefits outweighed any negative factors. Morrison himself was caught more than once, scratching Scraps behind the ears and talking to the dog in ways he would never address his own men. On the German side of no man's land, Corporal Weber had noticed a similar dynamic among his comrades, who had adopted a stray cat that appeared one morning and refused to leave despite the obvious dangers. The cat proved skilled at hunting rats, and this practical benefit justified her presence even to officers who normally enforced regulations strictly. Weber named her Minna after his grandmother, and fashioned a small bed from a spare uniform jacket that kept her warm during the worst cold. The men competed to feed Minna choice bits from their rations and debated whether cats or dogs made better trench companions without reaching consensus. These animals served as proxies for the domestic life all soldiers had abandoned, and caring for them allowed men to maintain connection to their humanity when everything else pushed them toward becoming efficient killers. The presence of innocent creatures dependent on human kindness reminded soldiers why they fought and what waited at home if they survived. The routine of trench warfare followed predictable patterns with morning stand, to when all men manned the fire step in case of dawn attack, followed by breakfast and maintenance duties that filled daylight hours. Sentries rotated through watches, while others repaired sandbags damaged by rain or enemy fire, and periodic patrols ventured into no man's land to probe enemy positions or retrieve wounded. The Germans followed similar schedules, and both sides maintained unspoken agreements about certain activities that made life marginally tolerable. For instance, neither side targeted ration parties during predictable meal times, and both refrained from excessive artillery during recognized rest periods. These informal truces existed alongside official hostilities and represented soldiers' attempts to impose human decency on industrialized slaughter. Officers discouraged fraternization and cooperation with the enemy, but frontline troops recognized that survival sometimes depended on mutual restraint rather than constant aggression. December brought rumors of Christmas truces, similar to the famous event of 1914, when soldiers from both sides had met in no man's land to exchange gifts and play football before returning to killing each other. High Command had explicitly forbidden any repetition of such fraternization and threatened severe punishment for anyone who initiated contact with enemy forces outside of combat. Despite these orders, soldiers on both sides quietly hoped for a respite from violence during the holiday season, when thoughts naturally turned toward home and family and peace on Earth. Hartley wondered whether the Germans across the wire felt the same longing for normalcy, while Weber considered whether British soldiers shared his exhaustion with pointless fighting that achieved nothing but mountains of corpses. Neither suspected that a small terrier would soon provide an answer to those questions, by doing what diplomats and generals could not, and creating a moment of genuine peace between enemies who discovered they were not so different after all. The stage was set for an event that would be remembered long after the war ended, by survivors who witnessed humanity triumph over hatred in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Heavy bombardment resumed on December 18th, as British artillery attempted to soften German positions, before a planned infantry assault scheduled for dawn on the 20th. The shells screamed overhead in a constant stream and exploded with earth-shaking force that collapsed sections of trench and buried men alive beneath tons of mud and debris. Scraps the Terrier fled into the deepest dugout he could find and trembled alongside soldiers who had learned that showing fear during bombardment did not constitute cowardice, but simple acknowledgement of reality. The barrage continued for 18 hours without pause, as British gunners fired shells manufactured in factories where workers would never see the results of their labor. German positions absorbed the punishment while men huddled in reinforced bunkers and prayed that direct hits would not collapse their shelters. Weber crouched in darkness with his hands pressed over his ears, while the earth shook and concrete dust fell from ceiling beams that groaned under the pressure. Minna the cat had disappeared during the first minutes of shelling, and Weber assumed she had been killed, but the animal reappeared 3 days later, having survived through instincts humans had bred out of themselves. When the bombardment finally ceased, the sudden silence felt oppressive and dangerous as men emerged from cover to assess damage and prepare for the inevitable British attack. The German trenches had been transformed into cratered ruins, with entire sections collapsed or blown apart, and bodies visible where shells had caught soldiers in the open. Weber and his comrades worked frantically to establish firing positions and string new barbed wire before British infantry crossed no man's land. But the destruction was so complete that defensive preparations proved nearly impossible. Officers shouted orders while men dug through rubble searching for buried comrades and salvaging weapons from the wreckage. The British attack came at dawn as predicted, with waves of soldiers climbing out of their trenches and advancing across open ground, while German machine guns opened fire from surviving positions. The attack failed as most attacks failed, with British bodies piling up in the wire, while survivors retreated to their own lines. Both sides counted casualties and prepared for the next round in an endless cycle of violence that accomplished nothing. In the aftermath of the failed assault, a temporary quiet settled over the battlefield as both armies licked their wounds and regrouped for further efforts. The British trenches had suffered counter-battery fire that killed 17 men, including a popular sergeant, who had survived 2 years of combat only to die from a shell fragment that severed his femoral artery. Hartley helped carry the body to the rear area, where graves registration would process it for burial, and felt the familiar numbness that came from losing another friend. Scraps followed the burial party and sat beside the fresh grave after the body had been interred, as if understanding that someone he knew would not return. Dogs mourned differently than humans, but no less genuinely, and the Terrier's obvious sadness affected the men who witnessed it. That night Scraps refused to eat, and instead wandered the trenches searching for the dead sergeant, until exhaustion forced him to sleep. The 19th of December dawned cold and clear, with frost coating the barbed wire and making it glitter like diamonds in the weak winter sun. Soldiers on both sides used the relative calm to perform maintenance tasks and write letters, and simply rest after days of constant stress. Weber stood watch during the morning shift and observed a fox picking its way across no man's land, apparently unconcerned by the human conflict surrounding it. The fox stopped to investigate something half buried in mud, then continued toward the German lines before changing direction and trotting back toward the British positions. Weber watched the animal with fascination because it represented freedom of movement that soldiers had lost and reminded him that nature continued regardless of human stupidity. The fox disappeared into shell holes, and Weber returned his attention to the British trenches, where he could occasionally see helmets moving along fire steps. Both sides maintained vigilance despite the quiet, because surprise attacks remained a constant possibility. Lieutenant Morrison conducted an inspection of his platoon's sector and noted with approval that Hartley had organized work parties to repair damaged sandbags and improve drainage. Morrison had learned to value soldiers like Hartley, who took initiative without requiring constant supervision and who maintained standards even in the worst conditions. The two men discussed rumors that the regiment would be rotated to reserve positions after Christmas, and both allowed themselves cautious hope that the rumors might prove true. Neither man mentioned the upcoming holiday directly because acknowledging it made the absence of home and family too painful. But both thought about previous Christmases spent in warmth and safety. Morrison returned to his dugout to complete paperwork, while Hartley organized a ration party to collect evening meals from the supply dump. Scraps accompanied the ration party, as always hoping for extra food and providing companionship on the dangerous journey through communication trenches. None of the men involved in these mundane activities suspected that within 24 hours everything would change because of an event so unexpected that it would seem impossible except to those who witnessed it firsthand and whose lives would be forever altered by what happened next. The collapse occurred without warning during the early morning hours of December 20th, when a section of British trench, undermined by weeks of rain and artillery damage, suddenly gave way, burying 4 soldiers beneath a wall of mud and sandbags. Men sleeping nearby were jolted awake by the rumbling crash and immediately began digging through debris with bare hands and entrenching tools, trying to reach their trapped comrades before suffocation claimed them. Hartley pulled himself from his own dugout and joined the rescue effort clawing at the mud, while others formed a chain to pass debris away from the collapse site. Scraps appeared from nowhere and began digging frantically alongside the men with his front paws, moving in a blur of motion as if he understood the urgency of the situation. The rescuers worked in desperate silence, punctuated by gasps of exertion and prayers whispered to gods who seemed to have abandoned this particular stretch of earth. After 20 minutes, they uncovered the first victim, who coughed mud from his lungs, and crawled clear while medics rushed forward to assist. The second and third soldiers were pulled free alive, but the fourth remained buried, and time was running out. Scraps suddenly stopped digging and cocked his head as if hearing something humans could not detect, then bolted away from the rescue site and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Hartley called after the dog, but received no response, and had to return his attention to the life or death effort of reaching the remaining buried soldier. The men redoubled their efforts, and after another 10 minutes of frantic digging, they broke through to an air pocket, where the fourth soldier lay unconscious but breathing. They extracted him carefully to avoid further injury and carried him to the medical station, where doctors would determine whether he would survive. The collapse had been caused by a combination of saturation and structural weakness that could have been prevented with proper engineering support, but such luxuries did not exist on the Western Front. Morrison ordered the entire section evacuated and reinforced before anyone else could be endangered, and work parties began the tedious process of shoring up the damaged trench walls with timber and corrugated iron scavenged from supply dumps. Across no man's land, German sentries had heard the collapse and reported it to their officers, who noted the information but took no action because targeting rescue efforts violated the unspoken codes that made trench warfare marginally tolerable. Weber stood watch during this period and could hear British voices calling orders and the sounds of frantic digging that indicated casualties. He felt sympathy for enemy soldiers caught in collapsed trenches because German positions suffered the same structural failures, and he had personally participated in similar rescue operations. War had taught Weber that suffering was universal and that the enemy consisted of individual human beings rather than abstract monsters. This understanding did not prevent him from shooting at British soldiers during attacks, but it did create moments of empathy when circumstance allowed such feelings. The morning stand to passed without incident as both sides watched each other across the scarred ground, while dawn broke over the battlefield in shades of grey and pale yellow. Scraps reappeared 3 hours after abandoning the rescue effort, and soldiers who had worried about the dog greeted him with relief and questions about where he had gone. The terrier carried something clenched firmly in his teeth and would not release it, despite coaxing from multiple soldiers who tried to see what he had found. Hartley eventually pried the dog's jaws open and extracted a small object that made him freeze in astonishment before calling for Lieutenant Morrison with urgent insistence. Morrison arrived within minutes and stared at what Hartley held in his outstretched palm while other soldiers crowded around to see what caused such commotion. The object was a child's cloth doll, no more than 6 inches long, handmade from scraps of fabric, with button eyes and yarn hair and features that suggested Germanic origin. The doll was filthy from mud and exposure, but clearly treasured based on its worn condition and careful construction. Someone had loved this toy enough to carry it to war and keep it safe until it was somehow lost in no man's land, where Scraps had discovered it and brought it back to the British trenches. Morrison turned the doll over in his hands and noticed a name embroidered on the back of its dress in neat script that read Greta, in faded blue thread. The discovery created a profound silence among the assembled soldiers, who understood immediately that this simple toy represented a connection between enemies that transcended the artificial boundaries created by war. Somewhere in the German trenches, a soldier carried this doll as a reminder of his daughter and had lost it during the chaos of combat or while on patrol. The thought of a German soldier treasuring a doll identical to toys that British soldiers carried in their own pockets created a moment of recognition that all men involved in this industrial slaughter were fundamentally the same. They were fathers and sons and brothers, torn from families and sent to kill each other for reasons that seemed increasingly meaningless when confronted with physical evidence of shared humanity. Morrison made a decision that would have resulted in court-martial if discovered by higher command, but which he knew was the only honorable choice available. He would return the doll to the German lines, and in doing so acknowledge that some things remained more important than military objectives. Morrison called for volunteers to approach the German lines under white flag and return the doll to whoever had lost it, knowing that such action violated standing orders against fraternization and could be interpreted as treason by officers more concerned with regulations than with basic decency. Hartley stepped forward, immediately followed by 3 other soldiers who understood the significance of the gesture and the risk involved in executing it. The lieutenant composed a brief note in his schoolboy German, explaining that the doll had been found by a British dog and was being returned out of respect for the universal bond between fathers and children. He wrapped the doll in a clean handkerchief and tied it securely, then gave final instructions to the volunteers about approaching the German trenches slowly, with hands visible and white cloth clearly displayed. The men waited until full daylight, when visibility would eliminate any possibility of misunderstanding their intentions, then climbed over the parapet and began walking across no man's land toward enemy positions. German sentries spotted the approaching British soldiers within seconds, and rifles were immediately trained on the figures moving slowly across open ground. Weber was summoned to the fire step and told to observe the situation and provide assessment of enemy intentions. He raised binoculars and saw 4 men walking upright with their hands raised and one carrying a stick with white cloth attached. The sight was so unusual that Weber assumed at first it must be a trick or some elaborate deception, but as the men drew closer, he could see their faces and recognize the genuine nervousness in their movements. He reported to his commanding officer, who arrived to observe this unprecedented development and debate appropriate response. The German captain was young and by the book, and his first instinct was to order warning shots fired to turn back the British soldiers, but Weber argued that men approaching under white flag deserved at minimum the courtesy of hearing what they wanted. The captain reluctantly agreed and ordered ceasefire, while calling out in accented English for the British soldiers to state their business. Hartley answered in loud, clear voice that they carried something belonging to a German soldier and wished to return it as a gesture of goodwill between men who shared common humanity, despite being enemies. The response created confusion in the German trenches, as officers conferred about protocol, and soldiers whispered among themselves about what the British could possibly want to return. The German captain finally ordered the British soldiers to approach close enough to hand over whatever they carried, but to come no closer than the barbed wire barrier that marked the forward edge of German positions. Hartley and his companions advanced carefully, stepping around shell craters and debris, while maintaining their white flag at high visibility. They reached the wire and Hartley called out again, asking for someone named Greta's father to come forward. The request produced stunned silence, followed by rapid conversation in German, as soldiers looked at each other in amazement and confusion about how the British could know such specific information. Weber felt his blood freeze in his veins when he heard his daughter's name spoken by an enemy soldier, standing 50 yards away in no man's land. He demanded to know how the British learned that name and what business they had speaking it in this place of death. Hartley unwrapped the handkerchief and held up the small doll for German soldiers to see clearly, and explained that their dog had found it somewhere in the wasteland between the trenches, and they were returning it to whoever had lost it. Weber recognized Greta's doll instantly and felt emotions surge through him that he had suppressed for months in order to survive. He shouted that the doll was his, and that he had lost it 3 weeks earlier during a nighttime patrol when it must have fallen from his pocket. The other German soldiers stared at Weber in amazement because none had known he carried such a personal item, and the revelation made him vulnerable in ways that combat never had. Weber asked his captain for permission to retrieve the doll, and after brief hesitation, the officer granted approval with strict instructions to return immediately without engaging in conversation with enemy forces. Weber climbed over the parapet and walked toward the British soldiers who waited patiently at the wire with the doll held out like an offering. He could see their faces clearly now, and recognized in them the same exhaustion and suffering that he saw every day in German trenches. These were not monsters or evil men, but ordinary soldiers like himself, who happened to wear different uniforms and speak a different language. Hartley passed the doll through a gap in the wire, and Weber took it with trembling hands while fighting tears that he had not shed since leaving home. He thanked the British soldiers in broken English and tried to explain how much the doll meant to him, and how he looked at it every night to remember why he needed to survive this war. Hartley nodded in understanding and replied that many British soldiers carried similar talismans, and that no man should have to fight so far from his children. The moment stretched into something profound, as soldiers from both sides watched enemies treat each other with dignity and compassion that High Command insisted did not exist. Morrison observed from the British trenches and knew that this simple exchange accomplished more toward genuine peace than any number of artillery barrages ever could. Weber stood at the wire holding his daughter's doll while facing 4 British soldiers who had risked their lives to return something precious that they could have easily ignored or destroyed. The gesture created a debt of honor that Weber felt compelled to acknowledge, even though regulations and military discipline demanded he simply return to his trench without further interaction. He asked Hartley to wait one moment and then turned back toward the German lines where he called to his comrades to bring something from his personal kit. Another German soldier appeared at the parapet, holding a package wrapped in brown paper, which he threw carefully toward Weber, who caught it and then offered it to Hartley through the wire. Weber explained that the package contained Black Forest honey that his wife Anna had sent in her last care package, and that he wanted the British soldiers to have it as thanks for their kindness and as recognition that sweetness could still exist in a world devoted to bitterness. Hartley accepted the gift with solemn appreciation, and the 2 men looked at each other across the barrier of barbed wire that represented everything wrong with modern civilization. What happened next occurred spontaneously, without planning or coordination, as if some collective decision emerged from the assembled soldiers on both sides. German soldiers began climbing out of their trenches and walking toward the wire, while British troops did the same, until dozens of men from opposing armies stood facing each other in no man's land for the first time since the unauthorized truces of 1914. Officers on both sides initially moved to stop this fraternization, but found themselves overwhelmed by the momentum of events, as hundreds of men emerged into daylight and approached the boundary between the armies. Morrison made the conscious decision not to interfere, because he recognized that something important was occurring that transcended military authority and that attempting to prevent it would likely cause more harm than allowing it to proceed. The German captain reached the same conclusion, and both officers watched nervously as their men began talking to enemy soldiers and sharing cigarettes and chocolate and showing photographs of wives and children and families. Weber and Hartley stood together near the wire and attempted conversation, despite limited shared language, and discovered that Weber had studied some English in school, while Hartley knew a few German words learned from a schoolmaster who had traveled to Bavaria before the war. They communicated through gesture and broken phrases and laughter at misunderstandings, and found that humor translated across linguistic boundaries better than formal speech. Weber showed Hartley the photograph of Anna and Greta that he carried, and Hartley produced his own photograph showing his parents standing outside their Yorkshire farmhouse with their sheepdog. The two men discovered they had both been farmers and both missed working with animals, and both hated the mechanized slaughter that modern warfare had become. They agreed that generals and politicians should be forced to spend time in trenches before making decisions about strategy, and that anyone who ordered men into no man's land should have to lead the attack personally. These sentiments were shared by soldiers throughout both armies who had long recognized that those making decisions bore none of the costs of those decisions. Scraps appeared from the British trenches and trotted across no man's land toward the assembled soldiers, showing no fear of the Germans, who represented enemies to humans, but to whom a dog recognized only potential sources of food and affection. The Terrier approached Weber and sniffed his boots before sitting and offering a paw in the universal canine gesture of friendship. Weber knelt and scratched Scraps behind the ears, while thanking the dog in German for finding and returning his daughter's doll. Other soldiers crowded around to pet Scraps and marvel at the animal whose innocent action had created this extraordinary gathering. Someone produced a camera and insisted on taking photographs to document the event, even though possession of such images would constitute evidence of forbidden fraternization. The photographs were taken anyway, showing British and German soldiers standing together and smiling while Scraps sat in the center, looking pleased with the attention. These images would survive the war and be passed down through generations as evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, people could recognize their common bonds and choose compassion over hatred. The spontaneous truce lasted approximately 90 minutes before officers from both sides reluctantly ordered their men to return to positions because higher command was certain to learn of the incident and demand explanations. Weber and Hartley shook hands formally before parting and wished each other survival and safe return home when the war finally ended. They exchanged names and addresses and promised to write after the war if both survived, though neither truly believed such correspondence would occur because the gulf created by years of propaganda seemed too vast to bridge. The soldiers retreated to their respective trenches and resumed watching each other across barbed wire barriers, but something fundamental had changed. They had seen enemy faces up close and recognized their own hopes and fears reflected in those faces, and that recognition made it harder to hate. Snipers on both sides found excuses not to shoot during the following days, and artillery bombardments seemed to decrease in intensity, as if even distant gunners sensed that something sacred had occurred in that particular section of front line. The doll episode, as it came to be called, represented a hairline fracture in the edifice of industrial warfare, and though High Command moved quickly to suppress knowledge of the incident, those who participated carried the memory forever. News of the unauthorized fraternization reached British headquarters within 24 hours and resulted in immediate investigation and threat of court-martial for all involved, especially Lieutenant Morrison, who as ranking officer present, bore responsibility for failing to prevent contact with enemy forces. Morrison was summoned to brigade headquarters, where a colonel red-faced with fury demanded explanation for behavior that violated standing orders and undermined military discipline. Morrison stood at attention and accepted responsibility while explaining that returning a lost doll to its owner seemed consistent with British values of decency and honor that supposedly justified the war in the first place. The colonel was unmoved by this argument and pointed out that wars were won through violence, not through gestures of kindness toward enemies. Morrison received severe reprimand and warning that any future fraternization would result in dismissal and disgrace. The German command responded similarly when reports reached headquarters describing how Corporal Weber and others had engaged in unauthorized contact with British forces. Weber was called before his regimental commander and interrogated about his actions and his loyalty to the fatherland and whether he had been seduced by enemy propaganda. Weber maintained that he had simply retrieved personal property and that brief conversation across the wire did not constitute treason or collaboration. His commanding officer was less punitive than the British colonel and privately admitted that he understood Weber's motivations even while officially condemning the fraternization. Weber received formal reprimand and reduction in rank, but avoided imprisonment or execution, which remained possible punishment for perceived disloyalty. Despite official suppression, the story spread through both armies carried by soldiers who rotated between frontline and reserve positions and who could not resist sharing such an extraordinary tale. The narrative grew in the telling, with some versions claiming that hundreds of soldiers had participated in an extended truce, while others reduced it to a simple exchange of items across the wire. What remained consistent across all versions was the central fact that a small dog had retrieved a lost doll, and British soldiers had risked punishment to return it to a German father who treasured it as connection to his daughter. The story resonated with troops on both sides because it confirmed what they already believed, that their enemies were human beings rather than monsters, and that ordinary soldiers had more in common with each other than with the officers and politicians who prolonged the war. Hartley and his section were rotated to reserve positions in early January and spent 2 weeks behind the lines, resting and recovering from months of frontline service. During this period, Hartley wrote multiple letters home describing the doll incident and explaining how it had affected his understanding of the war and of Germans in general. His mother saved these letters, and they survived to be published decades later as part of a collection of soldier correspondence that provided insight into conditions and attitudes during the Great War. Hartley described Weber as a decent man trapped in horrible circumstances and expressed hope that both would survive to return home to their families. Weber remained at the front through the winter and into spring of 1917, when his unit participated in the German strategic withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. During the retreat, Weber carefully packed Greta's doll with his few other possessions and carried it through hundreds of miles of fighting and hardship. He wrote to Anna describing how British soldiers had returned the doll and expressing gratitude for their kindness, even though they were technically enemies. Weber showed Greta's doll to other soldiers who asked to hear the story, and found that it became a talisman not just for him but for his entire company, a symbol of why they fought and what waited at home. Scraps the Terrier continued serving with the Yorkshire Regiment through the remainder of the war and became something of a legend among troops who heard the story of the doll retrieval. The dog survived multiple battles and several close calls with artillery before the regiment returned to England in 1919 after the armistice. Hartley arranged to adopt Scraps officially and brought the dog back to his family farm in Yorkshire, where the Terrier adapted to civilian life with apparent ease. Scraps lived to the age of 14 and spent his remaining years hunting rabbits and sleeping by the fireplace and being spoiled by Hartley's nephews and nieces, who treated him as a hero. When Scraps died in 1927, Hartley buried him on the farm with a headstone that read, "Here lies Scraps who taught enemies they were men." Lieutenant Morrison survived the war and returned to Oxford, where he completed a doctorate in classical studies and eventually became a professor teaching courses on ancient warfare and its differences from modern combat. He wrote extensively about his experiences in the trenches, and specifically about the doll incident, which he viewed as exemplifying the tension between institutional demands for violence and individual capacity for compassion. Morrison's academic work influenced a generation of students who studied warfare not just as military history, but as examination of how human nature responds to organized violence. He attempted to locate Weber after the war by writing to the address the German corporal had provided, but received no response, and eventually concluded that Weber must have died in the fighting. The photographs taken during the impromptu truce were preserved by several soldiers, despite orders to destroy evidence of fraternization. These images surfaced decades later when veterans began publishing memoirs and donating materials to military museums and historical archives. The photographs show tired men in muddy uniforms standing together without weapons and smiling genuinely, while a small dog sits among them looking absurdly pleased. Historians recognized the significance of these images as rare documentation of spontaneous peace initiatives during the First World War, and they were featured in multiple exhibitions and publications about the conflict. Modern viewers of the photographs often express surprise at how young the soldiers appear and how their faces show both exhaustion and hope in equal measure. Weber survived the war and returned to Bavaria in November 1918 when armistice ended the fighting. He presented the doll to Greta, who was then 6 years old, and told her about the British soldiers and the terrier who had saved it. Greta kept the doll her entire life and eventually passed it to her own daughter, along with the story of how it had briefly united enemies in recognition of their shared humanity. Weber resumed farming and never spoke publicly about his war experiences, except to share the doll story with family members who asked. He lived until 1954 and died peacefully surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as a gentleman who loved animals and hated violence. The broader impact of the doll episode proved difficult to measure, but veterans from both sides who learned of the incident reported that it influenced their post-war attitudes toward former enemies. Several British veterans traveled to Germany in the 1920s, specifically to meet former German soldiers and establish friendships based on shared experiences rather than continued enmity. These personal reconciliations occurred despite ongoing political tensions between Britain and Germany and demonstrated that individual relationships could transcend national conflicts. The doll story became part of regimental folklore for both the Yorkshire Regiment and Weber's Bavarian unit, and was passed down through successive generations of soldiers as example of humanity persisting even in war's worst conditions. The lessons of the doll episode resonated beyond the immediate participants and influenced thinking about warfare and reconciliation in subsequent decades. Military historians studying the First World War identified the incident as an example of how rigid command structures often prevented resolution of conflicts that frontline soldiers understood intuitively. The spontaneous truce demonstrated that when soldiers were allowed to interact as human beings, rather than as abstractions called enemies, they quickly recognized common interests in survival and return home. This understanding led some military theorists to argue that future conflicts should incorporate mechanisms for maintaining human connection even during hostilities to prevent the complete dehumanization that made atrocities possible. The doll itself became a family heirloom in the Weber household and was eventually donated to a German war museum in the 1980s, where it remains on display alongside photographs from the truce and letters describing the incident. Museum visitors often pause longest at this exhibit because the small worn doll makes the abstract horror of industrialized warfare tangible through connection to a specific child and father separated by conflict. Educational programs use the doll story to teach students about the human cost of war and the importance of recognizing shared humanity even when political systems demand enmity. The exhibit includes enlarged photographs showing Weber holding his daughter Greta in 1919 after his return, and later images of Greta as an adult holding the same doll she received as a child. Hartley lived until 1963 and spent his final years working with veterans organizations that promoted reconciliation between former enemies. He traveled to Germany twice in the 1950s and attempted to locate Weber or his family, but was unsuccessful due to incomplete records and the chaos of post-war displacement. Hartley gave numerous interviews about his war experiences and always emphasized the doll incident as the moment when he understood that propaganda had lied about German soldiers being fundamentally different from British troops. He argued that most wars were sustained by preventing ordinary people from recognizing their common interests, and that breaking down barriers between supposed enemies could achieve more lasting peace than military victory ever could. The story gained renewed attention during the 1960s, when historians began re-examining the First World War with less nationalistic bias and more focus on soldiers' experiences rather than strategic narratives. Several books featured the doll episode as case study in spontaneous peacemaking, and the photographs were widely reproduced in publications about the war. Veterans from multiple nations contacted historians to share similar stories of informal truces and acts of kindness toward enemies, suggesting that such incidents occurred more frequently than official records indicated. This research challenged prevailing narratives about the war being fought with constant hatred and revealed that soldiers often maintained codes of conduct that limited violence when possible. Modern military training sometimes incorporates the doll story as example of maintaining ethical standards under extreme pressure, and recognizing that enemies remain human beings deserving of basic dignity. The incident demonstrates that individual moral courage can create ripples extending far beyond immediate circumstances, and that small acts of kindness may ultimately prove more significant than grand strategic victories. The terrier who retrieved the doll accomplished through innocent action what diplomats and generals failed to achieve through deliberate effort, creating a moment of genuine peace that those who witnessed it remembered for the rest of their lives as proof that humanity could survive even humanity's worst impulses. The legacy of the doll episode extends into contemporary discussions about conflict resolution and the importance of maintaining human connection during periods of enmity. Peace researchers cite the incident as evidence that grassroots reconciliation often proves more effective than top-down diplomatic initiatives because ordinary people understand instinctively what professional negotiators sometimes miss, that former enemies must recognize each other's humanity before lasting peace becomes possible. The spontaneous truce created by returning a child's doll demonstrated this principle more effectively than any theoretical framework and provides template for modern peace-building efforts in conflict zones worldwide. Organizations working in post-conflict societies have adapted lessons from the doll story to create programs that bring together former combatants through shared activities that emphasize common humanity rather than past grievances. These programs recognize that people who have faced similar hardships, even on opposite sides, develop understanding that outsiders cannot fully appreciate, and that this understanding forms foundation for genuine reconciliation. Veterans from conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other modern wars have participated in exchanges inspired partly by historical examples like the Christmas truces and the doll episode, which proved that enemies could choose humanity over hatred when given opportunity. Greta Weber lived until 1998, and late in her life she shared her father's story with journalists researching the First World War. She described how the doll represented her father's love and his determination to survive and return home, and how the British soldiers' kindness in returning it proved that goodness persisted even in evil circumstances. Greta donated her father's letters and photographs to archives, ensuring that future generations could learn from his experiences. She expressed hope that the story would remind people that wars are fought by human beings with families and dreams, and that remembering this fact might make future conflicts less likely, or at least less brutal. The principles demonstrated by the doll episode remain relevant to contemporary challenges, including political polarization, ethnic conflict, and international tensions that threaten to escalate into violence. The story teaches that barriers between groups are often artificial constructs maintained by those who benefit from division, and that ordinary people usually recognize common interests when allowed to interact directly. Breaking down these barriers requires courage to risk punishment from authorities who demand continued enmity, but the potential rewards include not just ending specific conflicts, but transforming relationships in ways that prevent future violence. The British soldiers who returned the doll risked court-martial, but created legacy that inspired thousands. The small terrier who burst into a collapsed trench and retrieved a muddy doll accomplished something extraordinary by acting on simple instinct to carry interesting objects back to his pack. Scraps could not have understood the significance of his action or foreseen that it would create a moment of peace between armies, locked in industrialized slaughter. Yet his innocent deed reminded men brutalized by modern warfare that they remained capable of kindness, and that their enemies were fathers and brothers and sons just like themselves. This recognition did not end the war or prevent further killing, but it proved that humanity could survive even in conditions designed to destroy it, and that hope remained possible even in trenches that resembled hell.